Good Choices, a holistic conversation about dance, art, and life with Sabine Parzer. Hi, everybody. This is Sabine with another episode of Good Choices, a conversation about dance, art, and life. I was a little nervous before this one. I'm interviewing or I'm having a conversation with Hugh Milne. Hugh is my teacher. He is the founder of the Visionary Craniosacral Work. He is the founder of the Milne Institute. He is a third-generation Scottish osteopath who has combined his teachings with shamanic, Jungian, clairvoyant, and intuitive material in combination with highly anatomical and highly scientific approaches. He was born in 1948 in Scotland. He received his professional training at the British College of Naturopathy and Osteopathy in London, and continued to spend some time in India, where he lived for 7 years. Then he came back and lived in the United States, where he worked for 17 years at the famous Esalen Institute. And he's been traveling ever since. He teaches in Europe, in the US, all over the world. Many people have been inspired by his work, also by his book, The Heart of Listening, which is a 2-part book, which is the most amazing comprehensive guide to healing, not just craniosacral work, but to healing. And I'm super happy to share this conversation with you. Hi, Hugh.
Hi, Sabine.
That's wonderful. You could look at me. I don't really know how it works with the angles, so looks like you're looking at me.
I know where the lens is, except I can't see it. And if I look at the lens, then I'm looking at you. But if I look at you on my screen, then I'm not looking at the lens. So
whatever is best for our conversation, I guess.
Yeah.
Hi. It's lovely to see you here. Hi. I feel honored.
Thank you for the invitation.
Yeah. I'm a little nervous. I shared that already, but I think that's a good thing because I feel like it's bubbly energy and I'm curious. It's a wonderful opportunity to ask you some questions, and I'm super happy to actually my intention is to ask you some questions that are related to dance or related to the work that I'm doing, and I feel like there's many overlaps, but I often feel like, in the cranial settings, it's more about, your teachings and the cranial work. But there's so much more to your work that I feel like applies to healing or the healing context at large or movement at large. So I'm super happy to have you here at the podcast. Oh. Yeah.
Thank you, Sabine.
I started training with you in 2020. Which for me was a COVID gift because my schedule completely changed, and I think also everybody's schedule completely changed. And I remember taking your first course, C1, and I remember, I don't know if you remember this, but I asked you about when you place the hand on the sacrum and when you listen for the movement of the sacrum. I asked you what it is that you actually are doing, and then you asked me to come and demonstrate with you hands on and do a little bit of movement there. And I realized at that moment how much the work is about movement, and then it immediately sort of eased me into, I know about movement. This is my home.
Mm-hmm.
This is just another access to it. So I'm wondering if you have an early memory or one of your earliest memories in your life where you felt that you had a moving body or where you had a visceral sense about you moving in this world.
The memory that comes is of guddling. Guddling is a Scottish dialect word for how you catch river trout in little rivers in Scotland. You walk up the river to a curve and you bring your hand underneath the bank of the river where the river water has excavated almost a half tunnel under the edge of the bank of the river, and that's where the trout like to hide. And if you want to catch a trout for your dinner, that's where you go to catch the fish. And you can't see them. You go in with your hand and you find the underneath of the trout's belly, and you can feel the undulating movement of its tail as it holds its place in the moving water. And then if luck is with you, you catch it. And if luck is not with you and it tries to escape, the miraculous thing that so astonished me was your hand knows how to catch the fish. You can't see the fish, but your hand knows where the fish is likely to be. That's the earliest memory I have of the magic of hands.
Do you remember how
Does
old
that
you
help?
were? Yes, awesome.
Probably
old were you?
6 or 7.
Uh-huh.
About 6 or 7.
Yeah.
With a farmhand called Jock, who was a couple of years older, who knew how to guddle. And in the world of craniosacral, in essence, that's what you do. You trust your hands to follow a movement. And it can be miraculous. It happens before the mind. Your hands are doing something that cognitively you don't understand.
Are you a dancer?
No. My earliest experience of dance was at a childhood party when I was 5 or 6, about the same age, and a pretty young girl in her party dress asking me to dance with her. And in those days, rock and roll was the dance you did. And in the twisting part of the rock and roll, I twisted her onto the floor, and she fell on the floor, luckily without any injury. And I felt so ashamed and so embarrassed and so clumsy. It's my first, my introduction to dance was a trauma, a social trauma. Luckily not a trauma to her.
Yeah. But at the same time, the movement is at the core of your life experience as I perceive it. I don't know about your personal life, but in terms of your work, the way I've understood visionary craniosacral work is that at the end of it, it is about the movement. There is stillness and there's listening, but it is also about finding, or how would you put it in your words?
Well, I'd use your words.
Yeah.
I'd use your words. It's about stillness and listening and movement. And perhaps that all three are equal in importance. That wonderful line from T.S. Eliot, except for this point, this still point, there would be no dance, and there is only the dance. The paradox that in order to have a dance, you need stillness.
Which is such a good lesson for me, because of course I need more of the stillness, which you repeatedly remind me of. And then there is so much movement in the stillness, which is really beautiful. Yeah. I'm wondering, from that early memory and that definition of not being a dancer, was there any dance, like, I don't know, ecstatic dance or 5 rhythms or contact improvisation that you've encountered along your way that has been helpful or supportive to your practice of being in your body?
To be in my body, the most profound experience of dance was the Sema, Jalaluddin Rumi's whirling dervish ritual, which I did for about 2 years in India in the 1970s. And that was the most wonderful, profound, transcendental experience that at first you stand with your hands on your shoulders and then you unfold, and then the Sema, the dancing ritual begins. 20 minutes, 10 minutes you turn, 10 minutes you're still. That's repeated 3 times in an hour. And as you begin to turn, it's very obvious that you are moving and the world is still, but within 2 or 3 minutes of deepening into the turning, suddenly you are still and the world is moving. And it's a wonderful paradigm shift, a wonderful way to understand how complex life can be. That if I can be the stillness in the center of the cyclone, then my life can make sense to me and feel meaningful and be productive and enjoyable. And if all it is a cyclone and I'm being battered by it, then life is very tough and has little reward.
Yeah.
So Sema was the most powerful dance for me.
You did mention that you've done some contact improvisation as well before. Have you done that?
Yes, and I was lucky enough to meet the founder of the Five Element
Mm.
dance method. We were speakers at the same conference, and I took part in
Gabrielle
one
Roth.
evening of yes, met
Yeah.
Gabrielle Roth at the Breath of Life conference in London. Delightful woman.
Mm.
Part of the meditation sequences we had at Bhagwan Sri Rashanisha's ashram in India in the 1970s was a great deal of emphasis on movement and dance.
Yeah.
So it's not my preferred meditation today. Today I just do a sitting meditation in stillness, 48 minutes when I can. And then for movement I go walking. I do my best to do the 10,000 steps that people my age are recommended to take each day. That's my joy. Yeah.
Well, I can give you the feedback, and I think I've given that to you before, that me coming as a dancer and a body worker, but my first identification is the dancer. To come to your trainings, I have always felt seen, and I've always felt invited with the skills that I bring as a dancer to the table. And I don't know that that is always the case when you come to a bodywork situation or a technical anatomical training situation. And I just want to thank you for that, because I felt seen and recognized.
You're most welcome.
When I tell people that I'm doing your training, there's often a confusion around, or not confusion, but an association around craniosacral work. And I'm wondering if you can help explain like what's special about visionary craniosacral work. Maybe also, around the aspect of movement, and also how you have shaped it with the elements of the shamanic work or the Jungian work, just so we can have a little bit of a texture around that.
I was born into a vegetarian heilpraktiker or naturopathic family in Scotland in 1948. And at my age of 19, my mother spent a week teaching me basic Swedish massage so I could work on the patients in the family clinic. There was a 35-patient clinic, the biggest in Scotland at that time. And my grandfather was a pioneering naturopath and osteopath. And we did half-hour Swedish massages 6 days a week, starting at 9 in the morning, ending at 6. So it was something in the order of 50 massages. And on this particular Friday, at the end of the workday, a man came in for his Swedish massage and took off all his clothes, which is what people did in the 1960s without any shame or difficulty, and lay down on the table. And I remember leaning back against the door in the treatment room, wonderful old mahogany door, and saying to myself, I can't do this. I'm exhausted. How can I do another rub-a-dub-dub Swedish massage after having done so many already that day? And a stillness settled over me, and a voice came into my inner ear, hold his feet. And I didn't know what this was. I'd heard about schizophrenia, and I thought maybe I'm becoming schizophrenic and hearing voices. Hold his feet. So I thought, well, I don't know what else to do. I don't have energy to do the rub-a-dub-dub, so I held his feet. And after 4 or 5 minutes, the same voice said, now hold his sacrum. So I held his sacrum. And so in those next 25 minutes, the session unfolded. And at the end, the man got up off the table and said, what was that? That was amazing. That was the best session I've ever had. And I've been coming here 35 years. And I didn't know what it was. So I lied and said, that's what I always do. Because it scared me. It was a transformative experience. Something different came over me. And that was my first experience of cranial. that you listen to your guides. Perhaps they're external, what in Christianity we call angels. Perhaps they're internal, your own wisdom. Perhaps it's even a kind of blood lineage that your ancestors whisper to you. There's no way of proving those dimensions. In a class in Hamburg, Germany, what was that, 30 years later, somewhere in the early 2000s, a student asked me to define the difference between visionary work, biodynamic work, and the more Upledger Institute-orientated work. And I did my best to delineate the differences between the different schools as fairly as I could. And at the end, I didn't feel good about it because inevitably I favor the approach that works best for me, the visionary approach, and perhaps didn't say enough positive illuminatory things about the biodynamic or about Upledger's approach. And I went to take a rest in the office and gave the teaching of the class over to one of the assistant teachers and lay down on the floor to have a quick siesta. And as I was lying on the floor, the grandfather spirit of this work, William Gardner Sutherland, came over to me and said, "You shouldn't try to name it. None of the names are right." And there were his piercing blue eyes, his snowy white hair, and I woke up with a startle and thought, what was that? Was that really William Sutherland visiting me, or was it my unconscious? Was it a fantasy? Of course, I don't know, but the message to me is absolutely correct. You shouldn't try to name it. None of the names are right. What happened to me in that treatment room in Scotland in 1967, don't try to put it in a small box. That something can come over you and I when we feel safe with a client we have a meaningful connection with, that transformative things can happen that are beyond the realm of logic or deduction. It's in Carlos Castaneda's language, it's the nagual, the other, the non-ordinary, that in my experience all human beings know about. All human beings have had similar non-ordinary experiences. And in part they come for a craniosacral session to move into that space. As one client said to me, I come to you each week because this is my cathedral. This is my sacred space. Yeah.
What I appreciate about it is that there is, on the one hand, there's very clear anatomy, there's very clear technical information, there's a manuscript, there's anatomy to be studied, there is the sort of the grounded part of it, also the physiological part of it. And then on the other hand, there is the intuitive or shamanic aspect of it that is also laid out quite in detail. When you so-called teach intuition, it's for me, it's often like, or it has been in the past, people just kind of use the word intuition or just invite your intuition. And it's like, that can be so many different things. And one of the things that I love about writing the protocols, I really like writing the protocols, is that we have to list all the different channels that information comes through. So the hands, the eyes, the heart, the empath, the vagus nerve, the ear, the air. And oftentimes it's multi-layered. It's, oftentimes when I feel like I'm really in the flow, it's coming from all different directions, which is great.
Yeah.
But having the discipline to write the protocol and also having, going through your program, it allows me to really sense the different channels and sense, I have a preference. I'm much easier with my hands and much easier with my vagus nerve, but my ear is not as quick. And so just really the schooling of the different channels is just as important as the anatomy. And I really appreciate you bringing, the pedagogy behind it, the pedagogy behind intuitive work together.
Thank you.
Yeah.
It's a pleasure to offer it.
Over the years, you've been around for quite some time. You've been teaching for many, many years, decades. I'm wondering if you are noticing if you're noticing if there's a shift in people's needs or in people's process? I mean, the world is changing rapidly, but humans still have the same core needs. I don't know if that's too broad of a question, but in your workshops, in your trainings, do you feel like there is a shift over the decades of what it is about that people are needing?
There's far less externalization of inner emotional experiences. There's far less screaming and shouting, far less anger at my mum or my dad or my boss or my life partner. There's more internal reflection, more societal acceptance that it's me, myself, where the work must occur. And if I change, then my whole world changes. There's less focusing on the other person as being the source of my discomfort or my not feeling good. And at a less profound level, to me, huge shift from beginning to teach in the 1980s, when in German-speaking countries very few students were fluent in English, to today almost everyone is fluent in English. And with that comes a greater sense of belonging to the world, not just belonging to one country. And that's perhaps not so deep a shift, but nonetheless it's an important one.
And do you feel like that has also
That we become... Go ahead.
No, I was going to ask another question, so finish your sentence, please.
I must blow my nose first.
Okay.
Please, your other question.
So, if there is this shift, do you feel like is that partially because there's more access to different therapeutic practices? I mean, there's been a huge shift in terms of the abundance of different, trainings, shiatsu, just the availability of therapeutic practices or healing practices for people. Also, the luxury of people being able to afford it, having relatively safe or stable lives in the Western world, at least. Do you feel like that has something to do with that people are more focused in, or is that do you contribute that to another aspect?
Gosh, I'm not sure where to start. So I'll start historically, that in my generation, our parents were all in the military in the Second War, and that some large percentage of them suffered from shell shock or post-traumatic stress disorder. So we had parents who were traumatized by physical, emotional violence, and who did their best to navigate their way through that and not pass it on to their children. And nonetheless, in my peer group, the group of young people with whom I grew up in Scotland, there was a lot of physical violence, of the father beating the mother, the father beating the child. At school, you were beaten across your hands with a wooden stick or a leather belt across your bottom. There was a lot of physical violence, and money was hard to come by, and there was a lot of hard work required to be successful. And slowly that blossomed into the 60s, where there was this extraordinary social explosion of love and peace and the use of recreational drugs, most famously LSD. And then came the huge social change of the contraceptive pill, where for the first time young men and young women could explore their sexuality without the immediate possibility of pregnancy and therefore a forced marriage. So there were huge changes there. Part of what happened in the 60s was teachers came over from the USA to Europe and introduced the Encounter Group, Fritz Perls' Gestalt therapy, Carl Rogers' work with the Human Potential Movement. And so it became possible to shift from a world of parents who suffered from war trauma to senior figures, senior teachers, often from the USA, increasingly later from Europe, who introduced altogether different ways of seeing and being. That when I grew up, you didn't talk about feelings. Feelings were something you never brought into the public arena. That they were regarded as almost shameful. And then in the 60s, let's talk about your feelings. Let's explore your feelings. Feelings are where the juice is. Feelings are where the energy is that can transform your life. So a huge societal change. And mellowing then into the 2000s. What changes then? I think more largesse, more spaciousness. When craniosacral first came to my attention, about 1982 or so, I realized I'd been practicing it since 1967, since that experience in the treatment room in Scotland when I was 19, and that it had a name, craniosacral. And I thought, when I first began to teach it in London in 1984, this is just a fad. It won't last long. In a couple of years, it'll be forgotten. And it's amazed me how it's just grown and grown and grown. And I think the reason is that people need it. People need their cathedral. People need that still, silent place where stillness and movement are both welcomed. They can move into a deeper place. So, in summary of all the words I've just said, what's changed is from a world that basically denied or did not welcome inner experience, particularly feelings, particularly movement, especially if the movement was sensual or sexual, to a world where inner feelings, emotions are welcomed, harnessed, explored, and that encompasses touch, silence, stillness, meditation, dance. Yes, a new world, a totally different world. Anne Sexton wrote, "And how can we imagine ourselves amongst them? It was all so long ago and all so far from here." It's very different.
And I think in your account, the other element of that would be the meditation teachers. I think in the 60s, or I don't know exactly when, but that meditation began to enter Western world and Western minds, also parallel to the development of the different psychedelic drugs. But that people started noticing that there's a whole inner life and that there is a spiritual life that is also beyond the setting of a restricted religious life. I mean, I grew up in Austria, which is a very Catholic country. And, if I put it in that whole context, I feel that also the work of the family constellation work has done a huge amount of shift in especially the Germanic countries, Germany and Austria after the Second World War. So just to put that in the mix, I think it's what you have described is a almost like a quantum leap of many different levels. But what's moving, and what I'm hearing from what you said before, is that it is more and more moving towards the inner self and holding our own experience and transforming it through our own systems rather than blaming or fighting or accusing somebody else or even going through the drama of it. That was looping back to the earlier part of the question.
And that everything that does go on inside you has value and needs to be allowed and needs to be brought into this process of personal transformation. And it was John, Paul, George, and Ringo who introduced meditation to the Western world, in the sense that they found the Maharishi and went to India to study with the Maharishi and began transcendental meditation. And I think that was probably the first time, certainly, I heard of anything like meditation. The most famous rock group in the world suddenly decamps to India, to the ashram of a guru.
It takes the rock stars for us to listen.
Yeah.
There is a lot, what I'm noticing is there's a lot of, I'm just going to say it sounds a little demeaning, but it's not meant to be, but there's a lot of trauma talk out there. There's a lot of trauma trainings. There are trainings specifically centered around releasing trauma or helping people supporting to go through trauma. And when I look at the work of Ziggy Jung, and when I look at authentic movement, for instance, but when I also look at craniosacral work, I feel like the trauma work is embedded into something larger. Like for me, if I were to just look at trauma, I feel like people sometimes get stuck in a specific like if I'm just going to say it, if I'm just digging for the trauma, then I'm going to find trauma. But if I open up my awareness towards a larger unconscious area, I would say that there's a lot of resources as well as the trauma in there. And I'm wondering if you can share a little bit about your perception of how you work with trauma in the visionary craniosacral work, and if you feel like that, do you feel like you need to focus on it, or do you feel like it is an organic part of the process?
First, I'd like to loop back to family constellation work, which is this extraordinary gift to humanity of understanding things that you cannot see, that you cannot touch in any ordinary way, and that are nonetheless so powerful and so transformative. And so family constellation work, which in my understanding is an evolution of Fritz Perls Gestalt therapy, you have a wonderful example of the Nagual, of the invisible world that is so important to ourselves as human beings. When you are interested in people and interested to work with people, and when by your inner nature you are more of a healer than a mechanic, more of a intuitive than an engineer, then where your consciousness, where your awareness goes, is to where the pain is. So if you're a sensitive human being ready to help people, if you stand in the archetype of healer or intuitive or sensitive, and someone walks in, one of the first things you become aware of is where their pain is residing. And their pain or their trauma may be the first place you go to, particularly if it's the main focus of the client's attention, or their lack of joy in life, then of course you go to the trauma. But one does one's best not to get lost in the trauma, not to make the focus of your therapeutic hour with the client only the trauma, but to also look at what the potential is here, what their way ahead may be. I love some of the short, succinct sayings of Johann Wolfgang von Goethe, and for instance, and what is the hardest thing of all? To see that which is right in front of your eyes. Or again, Goethe, if you treat a woman as she appears to be, you make her less than she is. If you can see the potential in a woman and treat her as if her potential were already realized, you help her become everything she can become. So ideally in the therapeutic hour, that's included. Yes, here's your pain, here's what happened between you and your father, or you and your mother, or you or your brother or sister, and also here's your potential. Here's what I suggest to you as a homework that you can better access your potential. And I think each teacher, each practitioner has their own particular gift and their own particular way of working. And the small miracle is that the client finds their way to the practitioner who has what they need. And so the client for whom trauma, perhaps in their childhood, is the pivotal thing they need to clear, will find a practitioner who has a skill at clearing childhood trauma. And so the world unfolds. And so some of us work with temporomandibular joint dysfunction. Some of us work with conditions affecting the heart. Some of us work with childhood emotional trauma. And some of us hardly touch on trauma at all and work with potential.
I'm going to read from your book. Jungian analysis, of course. Jungian analysis, Marion Woodman, who is, very close to the authentic movement community, so it fits perfect. offered these insights into the burial of trauma in the body in what she calls psychotic corners in a lecture entitled Addiction and Sacred Emptiness. It's the therapist's job to find the client's soul and love it. That's all I'm really interested in, to tell you the truth. I believe that love is the healer, and I believe that you have to see with your third eye and hear with your inner ear in order to find the soul, because it is so stricken. It's so stricken by oppression that it fears to come out. So Marion Woodman talked about psychotic corners, and then Groff talked about coax. So could you explain those terms a little bit, or what we would also call the archaic wound? Could you explain those terms in relationship to trauma?
A story. He's a young man in a class in Wuppertal, Germany, and during the physical hands-on part of the class, he rolls off the massage table and he's lying on his back on the floor. He gets his head on the floor, arches his whole body off the floor, so only his head and his feet are on the floor. And I become very alarmed that he's trying to break his neck. He's trying to kill himself. He's processing some deep pain. And I go close to him and I say, what's happening? What's happening? He says, it was my fault. It was my fault. I said, what was your fault? That she's dead. I said, who's dead? He said, my wife. And I said, I'm not comfortable with you doing what you're doing. Come away from this posture. Just lie down on the floor. I don't want you to hurt yourself. Don't hurt yourself. What happened? And he described the moment that evening they drove home from the opera in Dusseldorf, and they're on the Autobahn, and he sees at the last minute another car joining the flow of traffic on his side of the Autobahn, and in a moment there's a collision, and next thing he knows he wakes up in hospital, and the surgeon in charge of his care tells him with great sensitivity that his wife did not survive the accident. His wife has died. That was his physical trauma, the reality trauma. His wife died in the accident. What happened to him inside? It was my fault. I should have seen the other car coming. If only I'd moved the steering wheel that little bit, there wouldn't have been the accident. It was my fault. I killed her. So that is a trauma in the past, which you could call an archaic wound or a psychotic corner, or in Upledger's terms, an energy cyst, that something is locked away inside my physiological memory that I need to exercise, that I need to process, else it will just take me into depression and self-blame. And in other words, what's really needed is simply to feel the feeling. And in his case, the young man in Wuppertal, my wife's dead. I miss her so much. It was so wonderful that we found each other, that we had those years together, and she's dead, and I still love her and still miss her. When Marion Woodman uses the term psychotic corner, it would be the young man on the floor trying to break his neck, rather than simply feel the feeling that his wife is dead and he so loves her and so misses her. That's the psychotic corner, a place which I don't want to go to because the pain is too extreme. John Upledger called the same thing energy cyst. I prefer something more neutral than using the word cyst or the word psychotic. I prefer archaic wound. That for most people to have a wound is somehow honorable or understandable. Archaic, old, something that happened in the past that has wounded me. And we hold that in our bodies. We hold that typically in places like our temporomandibular joint or our hip joints or our heart and cardiovascular disease. And if we can feel those feelings, she's dead, I so miss her, and I wish she was here, and I wish that hadn't happened. If we can feel those feelings, then the body can let the trauma go. And often it requires the presence of someone else. I, on my own, can't cry. If I think of something very sad, like my mother's death at age 47, I can't cry about it. If someone comes and puts their arm around me, then I can cry. there's some important thing about physical contact with someone you trust that allows deeper access to our feelings, that allows things like the psychotic corner, the energy cyst, the archaic wound to be unraveled, to come into the light of consciousness, and then we can let it go. We never forget the traffic accident in Wuppertal, but the emotional charge of it is largely gone as a negative experience, as a negative experience that affects our health and our physiology and our energy.
In so many ways, I feel like it's all the stories that we make around it, or it's the stuff around the actual pain. Or Robert Masters, he calls that the suffering and the pain. The pain
Yes.
is where it's
Good.
actually at.
Good.
Yeah, and Robert called
Yes.
it the suffering around it. It's
Yeah.
what we do also in order to cope with it, but it's actually creating. Yeah, it's not. We can't always get there, and it also takes time for us to get there. And I think a seasoned practitioner will also not push somebody there, but rather wait for it to emerge.
Yes, it's a great art.
Yeah.
To quote John Lennon, the truth is always just one deep breath away.
Mm. Mm.
But when that deep breath can come is very variable.
And it takes a practitioner who can actually hold where it's at. I feel like we don't necessarily have to consciously know it, but like if I get, as a practitioner, if I get caught up in the suffering or in the story, then I'm not at such great service to my client. If I can hold the actual true feeling, I don't have to push my client there, but if I can hold it with my presence, then I think it's much easier for my client to also feel it. Would you agree?
And they will tend to go there with you.
Yeah.
There's a sense it's safe to do so.
Yeah. Because they're not alone.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Because someone has their arm around them.
Mm. No, it touches me. So what's very related to that is the process of unwinding. So releasing of trauma, releasing of tension. Could you describe unwinding to people who don't know what it is about?
That when I do have a trauma, I may respond to it by stiffening or hardening my body. So if I have a trauma because of words I said that were unskillful, I may then start to hold my lower jaw and restrict the freedom of movement of my lower jaw. And if that trauma, my unskillful words 30 years ago, has then become embedded in a stiffness in my muscles, over a period of 30 years that may result in changes in the tissues of the jaw, and the pain, which is part of temporomandibular joint dysfunction, or TMD. Unwinding means you're drawn to touch the client's jaw because you see their jaw doesn't move freely, and you see the way they talk is they don't move their jaw very much. And so you're drawn to make contact there, and after you establish trust with the client, movement starts to unfold or unwind in their lower jaw, which then frees their neck, which then frees their breath, which then frees their feelings. So unwinding is that process of unlocking or opening a part of the body that's become armored. In Wilhelm Reich's words, characterological armor. We begin to soften the character armor of the human being, armor which is there because of trauma. And we call it unwinding. And unwinding always has psychological content. That is sadness, joy, blame, shame. And so part of what we're working with as we move the mandible or any other part of the body is the emotions, the feelings, the memories held in that part of the body.
And the high art of it is not to do the movement for the client, but to listen for the movement that's coming from the body, from the release. For me, that's the dance in there. It's like I might be suggesting something, or I might offer an invitation, but I don't want to push it. Like, I don't want to do the movement for them. So I have to really wait for the release and until I'm for me, that's the high art in there. I don't know how you would describe it, but it's like, again, it's this dance of listening what's coming from the client and what I can offer just a tiny little bit in order to help them also recognize that there's a new possibility.
That they seek to find someone who will help them release this body armor, and that the client instinctively navigates their way in life to finding the right practitioner for them, and at a certain point begins to let go of their armor, and then their authentic movement starts to manifest, and our job as practitioner is simply to follow that movement, except in rare cases not to initiate it, to wait for the movement to surface and then go with the movement. And the presence of the intelligent, sensitive observer or practitioner deepens that unfolding or unwinding.
You are familiar with the practice of authentic movement, I assume. Are you?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
I'm not sure if I could tell the difference between contact dance and authentic movement, though.
Yeah.
Perhaps you can explain that to me.
Yeah. Authentic movement is actually active imagination in movement. So it's with eyes closed. So it's not in touch. Contact improvisation is very clearly in touch. And authentic movement, there is it's a Jungian, comes from the Jungian analysis, comes from the practice of active imagination as Jung did it through drawing, so that you step into the experience. You don't have to have a plan ahead of time. You don't know what you're drawing. And in the same way, you close your eyes and you step into the space and you let the movement emerge. And at the same time, you have a witness who's holding their own experience. I'm witnessing the mover, but I'm actually witnessing myself. And so what it's been one of my main practices over the last more than 25 years. And what I've actually, and this is where I'm really curious, is what I've actually seen so much is that when people deepen into the practice of authentic movement, I find that there's a lot of unwinding that's happening. Unwinding of physical, emotional, even spiritual contact. And it's because there's nowhere to go, there's no intention, there is no performance aspect of it. There is just the space where you close your eyes and you listen to your inner body, and you listen to the space of what's emerging. So when I go, yeah, and then somebody gives them feedback. I mean, you can share about your own experience first, and the witness gives feedback. But they talk about, the witness talks about their own experience rather than analyzing or giving a judgment. So it's taught me so much about presence and waiting for what is emerging. And I feel like, to me, that's the parallel to the cranial work, is putting my hands on, witnessing myself as I have my hands on somebody, witnessing the movement of the mandibula, of the part of the toe.
I would say it's all the same field.
Yeah.
The presence of the witness in the authentic movement is energetically identical to the presence of the practitioner in craniosacral work.
Yeah. Now you know why I feel so at home. Right?
I see you in every second class I teach. I see the photos you sent me of you in your dance with your partner. Those wonderful black and white photos. Yeah, we're working with movement, with dance, with other people. Yeah.
I think this is a beautiful endpoint here. I really, really, really appreciate all that you give as a person, Hugh. I just really appreciate your big heart, your wisdom, and also your ability to really make deep contact with students. I've always felt deeply seen and deeply held by your presence and all that you have given through your teachings.
And as Jiddu Krishnamurti said, we do this together. I can't teach without fine students like you in the room. and the qualities you bring into the room allows me to go to those same deep levels that you already have reached. So we do it together. So thank you for showing up.
I'll see you soon.
A pleasure.
If you would like to know more about holistic dance and the Holistic Dance Institute, please visit us at our website www.holistic-dance.at. Holistic dance is an invitation to transformation through dance, movement, and touch. It was founded by me, Sabine Parzer, in 2010. It is a mix of different methods, a dynamic cross-method approach from dance pedagogical, dance and body therapeutic, systemic and holistic methods. We offer authentic movement, integrative contact improvisation, somatics and applied anatomy, improvisation, ecosomatics, and many more elements. I offer holistic dance workshops, I offer single sessions, I offer teachers trainings, embodiment trainings, advanced teachers tracks, year groups, and retreats. I would be very happy to see you at one of our events. And if you have any questions, please write me an email.